guys okay with this?
Already. Disrespect.
Yeah, it will.
The first is to talk about the interests of South Africa and what exactly you must preserve in this debate. The first is simply money, because aid allows you to focus more on developmental aspects, such as you being able to do whatever the fuck you want in your country because you have the money to sustain to do those things. The second is just because you are a rising country with a lot of investors coming in, you want to keep them and ensure that they always inject capital within you. Therefore, you want to create an image that they would want to see as sustainable. And that is why they remain within your country. In government, we prove why in the instance that you don't halt a lot of these operations, it's just far worse for you. And that is why you lose a lot of the capital that happens, that is injected right now. The next thing that I'll talk about is just the type of aid that you get from US specifically, and why importantly it's not something that you can lose in this debate. The first is just, it's not developmental aid specifically, because you likely get a lot of these things from other sources as well, such as China that will like bankroll you or whatever. So I want to note already at this point, this is not where the debate is most comparative, because that's simply not what most of the aid that you get from the US is. A lot of the aid that you get from the US is specifically one that gives humanitarian aid. This is just true for two reasons. The first is just they're quite liberal, they do a lot of these things, good, stop argument, whatever. The second is just, US relies a lot on soft power historically, and that's why the way that they have created their spheres of influence is one that portrays them to be a good guy that helps out in times of need. And that's why historically, empirically as well, you can observe that the way that they help South Africa is one that gives humanitarian aid. This is also just true, and the reason why they maintain this right now is because of the competition of spheres of influence that they have against China. So the reason why they want to continue sustaining the aid that they give is because they don't want to lose the connection to South Africa insofar as they're still perceived as good. What is this aid specifically, and why is it important? It's not just the liquid money that you have. It looks like you sending NGOs like Red Cross to give new vaccines against medicine or whatever, or the types of foods that they can eat in terms insofar as you don't have a lot of these things in South Africa. The second is just uplifting welfare as well. This looks like building more basic complexes such as schools, hospitals, shelter, for those people who are still affected by previous conflicts such as the previous apartheid. I'll take that later. But more importantly, it is these specific instances that you're far more likely to lose in the world of opposition, because I want to note specifically that in the instance that you don't rescind the act that you have, whatever the name of it is, I don't want to say it so long, it's precisely because they will investigate, and Trump will always have a reason to continue investigating insofar as they don't have a lot of the benefits that you can get when you have a lot of these acts. That is why they're likely to lose a lot of it. I'll take you right.
So Trump just ended US aid, and the US politics as a whole is moving rightwards towards foreign aid isolationism. What proof do you have that US aid will continue in the future?
Just specifically because it's beneficial for them to invest in a lot of these areas. A lot of the companies that are investing with South Africa, as we previously explained how they're rising right now with a lot of the companies entering in, are US companies. And that is precisely why Trump himself wants to investigate, because he wants to ensure that a lot of these companies will be able to sustain profits, whatever, that the space is just quite good for them. That is why Trump is necessarily interested in intervening a lot. If he just didn't care about South Africa at all, I don't think the debate would happen at all, and that is just why it's likely to continue. The first argument will simply talk about why the investigation must be stopped to ensure that the flow of aid is going to continue in. And I want to note that this is also just not contingent on the US specifically, because the results of the investigation also affects your perceptions and other actors that may want to invest in you. Trump will just continue to investigate in opposition, and so far as a lot of these acts still continue, it's precisely because he knows that it has an effect on the US companies that are investing in South Africa right now. It's just really bad for you for four particular reasons. The first is just it's unpopular to the people of South Africa, especially because they have to investigate a lot of local politicians, whatever, in order for them to get a lot of the results that they want. That is just why it will likely be seen as US intervention in the worst ways possible. That is why it's ultimately likely to lead to a lot of conflict internally. The second is just you can't control the findings that you get within the investigation. This means that things are interconnected, and if they investigate land, they're also likely to encounter a lot of more concerning things. And the reason why this is just true is because South Africa is still facing the remnants of the apartheid, and that's why it's quite likely for them to find something. The third is just, it signals to other actors that they don't know that you are quite a risky investment right now because your situation necessitates investigation. So even if it's not just US, you signal to other people that you don't know the condition of your own country, and that's why uncertainty makes you look like an unstable investment, and that's why other countries as well stop their investment on you. So we talk about how developmental aid is value neutral. Honestly, that's not really true, because what we prove at this point is that you also lose a lot of those things because they don't think you're a worth it investment anymore. They go to other places that are far more worth investing into. So even if they don't pull out, this also just proves why you lose a lot of capital in the short term at the point at which the investigation is still currently going on, because people don't want to invest unless the investigation is finished already. The last is just, when it is successful, then you just lose the reputation. It's because people become less hesitant to invest in you, because the US just proves that you are not a good actor, and you're inclined to believe, that people are just inclined to believe, because like it's the US, right? The second is just Trump does not stop investigating, and that's why it's likely to continue in the world of opposition. Therefore, a lot of the companies that are existing in these places are just likely to pull out of South Africa, and that's just bad, because as we proved in the first one, you just have less money to do whatever the fuck you want. The impact is quite simple. The first is just the less welfare that you get, which means people are just less helped in the world of opposition. But the second is just, it also means that South African government is forced to give that aid themselves, which is unclear why that's just good, firstly. But the second is just, it also takes away from the development that South Africa right now is able to focus into because they have the humanitarian aid. Second, why would Trump stop the investigation in the world of government? It's just precisely because you're no longer a threat to the US companies that are within the state. You cannot repossess their land or whatever. You cannot stop their operations without the act. And that's why he's also likely to stop, because he feels that if he investigates further without further reason, it's just unpopular within them because they're quite isolationist at this point. The last is just, to prove why this is necessary, is because it's your lifeline. You can fully focus on development investments because people are just sustained, as we explained, in the short term. But the second is just, regardless of how they act, it's just always guaranteed to go to the people in terms of humanitarian aid. The last thing that I want to point out as some sort of Hail Mary is already explained. It's just, there's a lot of companies investing in you right now at the point at which you don't stop these access when they feel that it's unsafe for them to continue staying there. So maybe the companies that are already there will not leave, but it means that people in the future will not enter South Africa because there's always a threat of them being repossessed. It also means that the companies you have right now are less profitable, and that is why they will likely leave in the future, because there's no other actors that will make them more profitable.
Right. Thank you, PM, to open up the opposition case. Hello.
Clarification. The land reforms and redistribution do not target foreign companies, and that is not why Trump is mad. So when this team says that you're repossessing land from US companies, that is not the context of the debate. This redistribution comes from the rich white minority who have historically owned land that is important, land that is in centralized areas of South Africa, and we are redistributing that kind of land to other areas within the country. The reason why you should care about this, the reason why you should believe this claim is, one, this is empirically true, the OIV knows this, but secondly, it's political suicide to take away land from foreign companies. Like, come on guys, you know this. Three things are proven in this speech that all independently take out opposition. Firstly, US aid is an unsustainable source. It is risky. It is not worthwhile. It is just not something you ought to prioritize. 5 reasons why. Firstly, because the US is facing a looming debt crisis that they must aggressively repay before interest rates rise, these individuals care a lot about the US debt. And that is the reason why the big, beautiful bill has split the Republican Party, because a lot of individuals within that party and within Trump's own faction is concerned about the debt ceiling. That is the reason why this aid is unsustainable. Secondly, under Trump and under the right wing that is growing in power in America, America is becoming growingly isolationist, which is the reason why they care less about these kinds of things. Thirdly, the US is short-termist. The US only operates on the 4-year election cycle calculus, which means that even if this team gets these kinds of aid right now, this will only last until 2027 or 2028 when Trump gets replaced and the whole process repeats over again. Fourthly, this aid is not effective, and the reason why is because Trump has dismantled US aid and much of the institutional frameworks that are used to disperse this aid, which means that you don't benefit from economies of scale, which means you don't benefit from established expertise. So even if you throw money at the problem, the way in which you distribute the aid and the way in which you have oversight over the aid is significantly mitigated. And given that South Africa is slightly corrupt, maybe corrupt, then it's incredibly questionable whether or not you get this investment in the first place. But lastly, the US just has other allies that they must prioritize. Think about Israel, think about South Korea, think about Taiwan. So when this team says that the US cares about soft power, this is not reflective of Trump's approach. Trump cares about hard power, which is the reason why his attempt to mitigate against China is not to give aid to everyone else, but to take that aid and reinvest it into military assets that he will deploy in the South China Sea, and that is Trump's strategy. So this team is already out from the get-go, out of this debate. First argument, there is an urgent need for land reforms. This is what the majority of South Africans want. South Africa is a nation stuck in the past. The apartheid government has left deep racial inequalities across land ownership and therefore wealth. The ANC is corrupt, but it still has not been ousted from the government because corruption and service delivery failure is pressing issues within the South African electoral landscape. Who owns the land right now? The people who own the land right now are the land-owning bourgeois who originally acquired these land through apartheid and through uneven land redistribution. The reason why they own the majority of land is because as South Africa opened up and foreign companies started flooding in, the price of land appreciated, and what these individuals did was they mortgaged their existing land and used these mortgages and used this fund money to buy even more land. And this land was in important areas. It's things like centralized land. It's things that are incredibly important in major urban centers. And those pieces of land that are incredibly important are owned by these individuals. And what they did was that they were able to lease out this land. They were able to use that money to pay off the mortgage. They were able to get even more mortgages. And so as the price of land rose, these individuals acquired disproportionately more and more power. The end point and the bottom line of this argument is just that rich people and property management companies do this on a massive scale within South Africa, and at the very least within the major urban centers where land is most important. This is important because this land is big and it's in central locations. These individuals use their first mover advantage to buy this important land, and they've gotten dividends upon dividends on this land as time went on, which allowed them to consolidate their power and consolidate their economic wealth. This land is in strategic locations, it's incredibly interconnected. What does this bill do under outside the house? Firstly, it looks like converting this land, like repossessing this land and converting it into public infrastructure and utilities. Think about hospitals in central locations. Think about more schools for South Africa's population. Think about things like power stations that help South Africa's electricity situation. And it's important to provide these utilities because the location is important. It's logistically impossible to set up power lines if you're building a new power station in the outskirts of the city, for example, which is the reason why this team cannot go out these benefits. But the second thing we would do is that in rural areas, we would redistribute this land so that individuals on the ground can do things like subsistence farming, so they can weather the poverty and weather the unemployment that's endemic in South Africa. 3 impacts. Firstly, people live another day, and this is the most important impact in the debate. Poverty is the life-threatening issue in South Africa. 63% of the population live under the poverty line. South Africa has the highest income inequality in the world with a 0.6 something Gini coefficient. So the most pressing threat to the majority of individuals on scale within South Africa is poverty. We alleviate it. Given that this is 60% of the population, we pretty much win on scale. Secondly, this allows us to alleviate crime. South Africa has one of the world's most highest murder rates. Things like violence and things like crime are at an all-time high. And the reason for this is because these crimes of necessity happen at such a large scale that the police, that the underfunded and understaffed police force simply cannot keep up, which threatens the lives of individuals on a massive scale. But lastly, we unlock financial loans and investment better under our side of the house, so we provide a roadmap for success. South Africa suffers from repeated centralized power cuts because of load shedding due to electricity shortage and poor power infrastructure. Under our side of the house, we will rectify this by reclaiming this central land and reinvesting it into the infrastructure. Go.
So all of this needs money. Where do you get money if you scare all of them away?
I don't understand why we scare all of these people away. Their conception here is that the investigation scares individuals away, but I already explained why the premise of the investigation being scary is not true. Like, Trump can gesture at investigation, but it's unclear why South Africa has to comply or why they care. The impact of the last argument is just that, unlike the misconception of government, South Africa is not a burgeoning business center. No one wants to enter and do FDI or build their own companies in South Africa at the moment because they are economically unviable, because things like power cuts hurt your bottom line. Under us at the House, we provide a better roadmap for access. Second argument, this radicalizes the current protests within South Africa. South Africa already has frequent protests by the 80% of the black population against the rich white elite. Think about the fees must fall student movement, think about the housing crisis, think about things like service delivery and shoddy electricity infrastructure. These people were placated when South Africa signaled that they would redistribute the land, and so they had their hopes up when the government of national unity signaled to the individuals on the ground that they would redistribute this land. Under that side of the House, this gets far worse, because if these individuals had the hope that these problems would be fixed, and then had that hope ripped away from them by an interventionist foreign US government, these individuals will take to the streets. These individuals are upset. These individuals reach the boiling point, and that deters foreign investment far more because of instability of things and things like violence. Yep.
All right, thank you, Alo. Can we have TPM?
The thermostat is at the back of the unit.
You're turning it up, is it?
Yeah. I'm making it colder.
Damn,
Colder or
Colder, please.
colder?
It's quite hot.
damn, bro, my hand's cold.
Strategies, you know.
This is climate warfare.
Good luck.
It's okay, I'm done.
Sorry.
The investigation that will come from the US is likely to be aggressive, public, and one that legitimizes South Africa's position in the global order. What we say under this is simple. Precisely because Trump often wants to entrench power and his legitimacy, he will likely use this investigation as one to show why he is legitimate in doing this. But more than that, it is likely to manifest in a way that is public for 3 reasons. First, you want to justify funding for this, and that's why you're likely to publicize, for example, that you're doing this investigation because you suspect the South Africa, for example, is evil. You suspect suspicious forms of behavior that involves illegality, and that's the reason why you want to investigate. But second, you want to defend it within the Senate and Congress in terms of funding, and that's the reason why you're likely to, for example, make it public. But the last thing under this is just that when people are on the ground, when they are in your Congress, for example, in South Africa, when white men try to investigate politicians, it is likely to have a lot of media coverage. What this does is position South Africa as one that is illegitimate towards the global standards, and that's why it is not just some aid that you do not get. It is aid from other countries, aid from Europe that you do not access, aid from the US, and aid from more and more NGOs, precisely because they see you as evil, precisely because they see you as corrupt. That is a lot of money that you do not access, and this is why it was unclear that just because you repossess land, it doesn't mean that you have utility over that land. You do not have the ways to develop it, precisely because your people are starving, and that's why you have to allocate your money towards them. And as far as unclear why the repossession of land by itself is good. The next thing under this is just to talk. About the ways that they attack US aid. There are 3 ways they do this. They say under this that it's short-termist. Often Trump is a bit crazy, and that's the reason why he wants to do this. And often they are isolationists. There are multiple reasons as to why this is not true in terms of South Africa and the nuance of South Africa. What we build from Kyle is that South Africa is unique in how it is positioned, precisely because of the things that it has, such as untapped workforce, such as, for example, rare earth metals that you probably would want, precisely because China also competes with you in this. So perhaps US aid is shit right now in some select regions, but you probably would want to safeguard South Africa insofar as it is the battleground of resources. It is the battleground, for example, of economic power, of how we legitimize, for example, the US interests. But more than this, if it's true that it's likely to be short-termist and corrupt and often gotten by a lot of corrupt individuals, I would note that corrupt individuals individuals often have the ways to want to legitimize themselves as well. They reinvest this on things that makes them power, that is media, that is healthcare, which is itself by itself good, precisely because it still breeds things that are good for a lot of people. They're just accessing healthcare when they build hospitals, they just schools, etc., etc. And they're likely to do this precisely because if you're a corrupt individual and just want to be corrupt, a lot of people will hate on you if you don't do things for your, you don't do things with that money that you get. So you probably want to make sure that people see some investment, see some infrastructure, and that's the reason why you do this. It is worse on their side, precisely because if aid is not accessed and corrupt individuals would want aid, what they do is they corrupt taxes, they corrupt things more, things such as subsidies for individuals, things such as, for example, the profit that you get from your economy are things that automatically escalates to them. At least on our side, you tamper this off precisely because at least they corrupt aid and not the things that you get from your real economy. And that's the reason why at least we have more money on our side. That's the reason why development exists. The next thing under this is to talk about, the next thing under this is just a position, for example, how does the investigation will work and why this is bad. They say under this, and if you listen at the Prime Minister, they say that the reason why you have to do this is because it is a white minority who are often entrenched with power, often have the ability to control, for example, the resources, and that's why you want to take it away because they're too powerful. If they are too powerful, the question then is how does South Africa take away land from powerful individuals that can, for example, fight back? We say that you do this in ways that are quite evil. Just for example, not honoring ownership, not making sure that you break down licenses and things like this. What this does is that precisely because you do it in ways that are quite legal and suspicious towards the liberal mind, the way that you are investigated therefore is likely to be as aggressive as well. Precisely because how you do it is aggressive. And if people find out, that's the reason why you're likely to be more delegitimized at the end of the day. Let's talk about the alternative sources of funding. They'll say under this attack that, well, you have China and other countries that you want to get aid with. The problem with other countries is this. The first is that China is likely to be the real comparative on their side, precisely because they are already within the region, and it just makes realistically easier to do that to China, right? So the problem with China is that often they just don't do aid. What they do is loan and conditional loans for a lot of these South African nations. This looks like, for example, giving you building you trains and building you media enterprises, but they own those enterprises, they own those trains, and that's the reason why they profit over for 10 years before you're able to take ownership of these kinds of development. So if they have some aid, we show why South Africa does not benefit directly from that aid, precisely because it is developmental aid that usually people don't get access with. This looks like, for example, how China injects their own workforce and imports their workforce towards South African countries. That's why, for example, in construction companies, it is not Africans that work in there, but mostly Chinese workers that go, precisely because they want, for example, to solidify, to make sure that their own citizens have work when they do loan. What this does is that it is unclear why aid or any alternatives of aid on their side will benefit the people on the ground. And this is the reason why humanitarian aid is important. That is because on our side, when humanitarian aid is secured, it is prerequisite to a lot of things. First, in terms of economy, when people don't starve, when people are actually getting the things that they want, at least some nutrients, your ability to go to school, what you do is you empower your workforce, which is good, precisely because now you just have more ability, for example, to improve economically. Sure.
No amount of aid or capital will be effective if we do have land reforms to implement the capital effectively. We are logically prior.
So the problem with that is that it assumes that states would not want to cooperate. If it's true that rich white minorities are probably corrupt and want to entrench power, and you have a lot of money, there's incentive to collaborate with you because you're able to have access towards a lot of that money from the state. It's just quite unclear why you would not want to do that. So that just shows why collaboration is good. The next thing under this is just to show why position aid as important. So the reason why this is important is in terms of how it dictates economic stability, but also how it dictates political stability. They say protests will be bad, precisely because you don't take away land and they want land. But the problem with this is that on their side, you take away a lot of aid, which a lot of people will be hungry. And that's the reason why there will be a lot of more and more protests on the ground. And it's the reason, for example, why it's difficult to become economically stable. The reason why your investments, for example, fly away from your country is not only because you are seen illegitimate, but because it is confirmed by how the public reacts upon that investigation that is done towards your country. What this does is position South Africa to become more and more weaker, precisely because not only do you take away US aid, but you take away aid from other and more countries, and that's the reason why people go hungry on their side. That's the reason why land, even if it was gotten, does not have any utility on South Africa.
Thank you, DPM. Can we have yellow?
average person in South Africa is a hostage. They're held hostage by the land-owning elites who have bought up land in strategic locations in vast amounts. This makes further economic development impossible because to build a new power plant or a new school, the most strategic locations have already been bought up. So you are left with two options. Either pay exorbitant prices to use those land, or build them in inaccessible locations, driving up costs and risking people not being able to access these infrastructures in the very first place. Expansion into the suburb is also not viable because the rich have bought up large swaths of land here as well. The way in which they did this was to mortgage the land that was the strategic one to businesses, and with the appreciation, borrow more money to then acquire more land into the suburb. The bottom line here is this: South Africa's economic development is held hostage for the elite for like massive payouts into perpetuity. Like, we don't even know what is a fixed mechanism here. It runs into the future forever. So it's okay that we take away land from the elite because they've already benefited, and insofar as there's no path forward, this is our only solution. If this premise is true, what that means is, as of the moment, South Africa is just not the attractive investment vehicle that they make it out to be. Actually, realistically, it borderlines a failed state. Given its poor infrastructure, inequity, and cost of doing business, it's impossible for them to explain why is it the case that actually businesses are just killing themselves to enter South Africa right now. They have been stagnant for the past 10 years. Unemployment rates are 60%. The Gini coefficient is 0.63. Power outages routinely make the news. You have seen these things. They last up to days, which greatly disrupt businesses, which then makes South Africa lose competitiveness because doing business there is just bad because you cannot forecast your business performance because if power goes out, you cannot manufacture, you end up failing contracts you've signed with your customers, and therefore this is just not a good place for you to use for your means of production. Look, South Africa woes literally could not be held in Cape Town because of crime and instability. If you cannot even hold woes there, I just don't know what investment vehicles they're talking about. So the bottom line is this: the trade-off is extremely small because there's just not a lot of things that we're giving up right now because it's a fail safe. No one wants to put investment there in the first place. But the massive growth potential is for us to unlock because we identified to you that the root cause of this is unemployment. The root cause of this is poor infrastructure. To increase infrastructure to people, the way to do that is to build them cheaply and make them accessible. That's a unique mechanism that Litwin provided you no response. The next thing then is that they claim that aid from the US is likely to be more than aid from anywhere else. To paraphrase, they claim that the aid from the US and other countries is likely to be larger than the money from redistribution. So now we're talking about the amount of money that can funnel towards improving South Africa. But just know, they have to fix the problem first. We have given to you the structural nature of the problem. So it's not just about the money, it's about how we unlock the obstacles right now that can allow us to access growth. But I'm going to fight them on money anyhow. This is untrue that the US and other countries have the capacity to give you more reliable money for you to work with to improve South Africa. The first reason is, regardless of whatever incentive that they can give us for the US, I think the incentive to pander to the people within those countries are bigger. And it's easier for you to do that when you say, look, we have a spiraling debt crisis. It's important for us to protect the people in America first. Therefore, we'll cut off aid. That's just a lot more electorally popular. And if it's the case that you don't use that rhetoric, someone else is going to use it for you. So you're forced to use that rhetoric anyhow. What that means is, this is probably the biggest incentive because any impact of power only accrues when you get into power in the first place. If it's the case that there is incentive for you to become like a big bad nation later on, Trump accessed that incentive much later on once he's in power already, but before that he has to make the promise to cut off all these things to improve the lives of the Americans first, and that is realistically what he effectively did already. You've seen on the news how he's cut off aid for HIV and every other kind of things, despite the fact that it's hugely unpopular, because the American people matter more than anyone else. The second thing is, the money is that we provide to you. It's not just in terms of the money that we can use by saving costs on the infrastructure project because we have reclaimed the land and use it for infrastructure because we can use the land cheaply. It's also about economic viability. At the moment, if there's no economic viability, what we are unable to do is tap into loans and investments because people think that we just don't have a way to pay them back because South America is in such a bad position. Unlocking the vehicle of prospectively developing itself makes it so that we're an attractive location for investment as well, and that is when we're able to access cheaper loans, allows us to then finance all the infrastructure projects and all the welfare that we previously talked to you about. There's a small caveat here. They make a big deal about the incoming investigation. I want to point out this is not necessarily a bad thing. And the reason for that is because the investigation is a key mechanism as to why we're going to do things well outside the house. We have both acknowledged that there's an element of corruption, but if it's the case that you are actively being scrutinized for the way in which you redistribute that land, I think given that you've already seized it, the way for you to just make the most out of it is to do it in a way that benefits a lot of people so they can access all the loans that we talked about earlier. on their side of the house, what is the mechanism for you to distribute humanitarian aid effectively? There is none. There is no investigation, and what that means is that even if it's the case that they can access humanitarian aid, and even if it's the case that humanitarian aid is actually in quantity bigger than the amount of investment that we get, there is no check and balance mechanism to ensure that that effectively reaches the people. What that means is that they don't end up accessing the impact of helping people in the very end. The bottom line here is this. If it's the case that you have to fix Africa, you only need money, and this is again not the problem. We've already set up a structural problem. It's only money. On outside the house, we're more likely to get that money, even if it's the case, this is like the secondary even if it's the case that they get more money, we have a structural check and balance mechanism to ensure that the small amount of money that we get is utilized well. It's unclear why the bigger amount of money that they have is used in a way which that actually helps people. At this point, you have to give me a POI. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The last thing is the kill switch from our outside house. The motion is not this house regret this deal. It is that it will rescind. I bring you back to my previous analysis on where is the fail state right now. Imagine yourself as a person living in South Africa. Your life was doomed. It is hugely unpopular. You risk your life engaging in crime to make a living for yourself. The state sees this and bite the trade off. They move against the most elite people in the country to bring this thing into fruition. Now there is hope. The country as you know it is going to fundamentally change because reality is no longer applied by which you previously understand. That there is capacity for the state to promise you a new beginning, and that is why this thing passed in the very first place. There is sufficient popular will. What happens when you take this away? They have not answered this. I think what's going to happen is that the instability and the crime problem is going to explode, it's going to increase exponentially because there's just no alternative for people anymore. They don't know where to look to. How is it the case then that South Africa can effectively improve itself? What that means is, even if it's the case that South Africa is a good financial investment right now, it's no longer going to be one if it's the case that you rescind because you risk instability, you risk conflict, you risk improvements, further you risk political instability, and it's at that point that I think investors, even if it's the case that South Africa is a structurally good financial vehicle, if it's the case that instability from the people is just so massive and disruptive, it's no longer the case that they'll still invest. For all these reasons, opposition.
Alright, thank you, Diallo. Can we have cover whip?
Give me a moment.
At this point in the debate, the problem with government is that they do not, the opposition rather, is that they do not prove that the ownership of land by the white people will equal to state development. I want you to know that at this point in the speech, they have no positive case. Their only positive material is that there will be less internal conflict, but not why this internal conflict will be valued over the subsistence that the people currently need on the ground. So the first thing I want to prove is this. When white men want to ROI their land and collaborate with the state, they are forced between two choices. It's either one, the state partners up with other investors that get to claim ownership of this land because they are more reasonable than the people that might stay there, or that two, they are just forced to give up a large part of this land entirely, which is bad for the interests of South Africa. So the first thing I want to do in order to break this down is why they are likely to cooperate with these people. The first is because they get to just maintain a small ownership of the land at a small trade-off of this humanitarian aid. What does this do? It means that there's a certain amount of benefit for the people on the ground, which is why more of these people just get more help in comparison to the more long-term impact of opposition, where they have to prove more people get more aid at the expense of government overhaul. Secondly, they are just seen as a benefactor for this development. So whoever owns this land also gets to maintain more of this land in the future because they are seen as the people helping these people on the ground. So they get to maintain this, but at the expense of helping people with the most important benefits currently. What does this prove for the round? The first is that there's just more certainty within the benefit of side government, because opposition's benefit can only manifest if they can prove that people value their autonomy over subsistence. So that's the first thing I'll do in weighing. The second thing I'll do in weighing rather. So the first question we need to answer is, does investigation mean you get access to resources? Firstly, this is inconclusive. This is because at no point in the debate do they respond to our case on investor pullout. The only thing they say is that US aid right now is unreliable. But we say from here that it is currently reliable because the current companies within South Africa are US based and they want to keep aid there because it is a welfare and because it is an abundance of natural resources and an abundance of workforces that you can claim at that point in time against other dominant powers. What does this mean? It means that the nature of investigation, not investigating foreign companies, is like symmetric because it shows that the current US companies that will remain are going to be the ones that give the aid to people as well for more development in the future, but also the same people who likely want to collaborate with the same individuals if it means that they can appease the current internal conflict right now. The stronger material right now is that you reduce internal conflict, but I want to weigh this incentive overall. Our burden requirement is to making people really happy, is to just making citizens sustain, right? We give them basic necessities that are urgent right now, especially if they are remnants of apartheid harm. Think Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I can't believe this. The citizen priority right now is subsistence, not autonomy. Why is this true? Number one, the simple reason is because they lack the necessities to feel like they are safe at this current point in time. So the more threatening thing to their life is the lack of food, the lack of shelter, and the lack of medicine, not the lack of sovereignty. So the second thing that we would say is that the future threat of losing sovereignty just feels like a more long-term harm. The more important thing they think about right now is making sure that they survive until the next day. How does these two incentives weigh against opposition? Because one, ops logic requires you to believe that they are logically prior, but there's a timeline problem. The timeline problem is that A, it requires you to believe that the average citizen values autonomy over subsistence. But what I prove is that the most intuitive thing that citizens will value is their life, not their sovereignty. Secondly, assuming subsistence is sufficient, it's not clear why the land is usable when there is less money available. At this point in their speech, they don't prove why their alternative is enough. So even if they get some amount of aid, this aid is not reasonable enough to be sustained in the long term. So even if there is an outcome of some benefactors making private investment and complexities, and their concession is that we have less quality like complexities, but say complexity overall, it's not clear why this would be beneficial for the future needs of the people. For example, if they get hit by another electricity power, who's gonna make sure that these people are cured at a sustainable rate? If they lose more to the summer heat, who's gonna make sure that these amount of individuals are going to get cured at the long term? What did this prove? The first is that even if there's a usable amount of land and a usable amount of resources, they just build cheap complexes, and it means they fix less things. Because these are the things that they cannot maintain and sustain for a longer amount of time. The things that we prove right now are the things that are short term, yes, but they are the most important. They are the things that give people the ability to survive another day. So while the state gets to give these resources to the people, in return, the people who then maintain this land are forced between the same two options I said earlier. It's either give a small amount of these resources in exchange for keeping this land, or surrender this land to other investors who might be more willing to help appreciate the South African citizens. What this means is that, A, regardless of who owns the land, there is benefit for the people. But that secondly, even if this land is surrendered, right, what ends up happening is that we have the ability to give the people their most subsistent need right now, and that's a certain benefit.
Trump's executive order was a political stunt to save on foreign aid while appeasing his majority white base at Elon Musk. But Musk and Trump have fallen out, and Trump has no incentive to pressure other countries to cut aid.
No, because we've already proven that the people staying within these areas are the people they need to keep there. So they will just keep giving this aid to them because they understand it's a good part of what makes them strong right now. This first question is now answerable by the conclusion that even when white people in general are corrupt, at least people get aid. But that secondly, this aid itself is the most important right now. So it doesn't matter if it's short-termist. It itself is a benefit because ops long-term benefit is uncertain. You ought to value us over them. The second question I want to answer is the economic viability really the harm we need to solve? Because right now, the economic viability is only if you believe that every US company operating there is one that is inefficient. But we prove that they have values to be efficient on that side, right? The first is because we have the ability to give them the resources that they need from Africa. And the second is that we give them the workforce that they need in order to alleviate themselves from whatever global competition they have right now. How does the investigation affect this? When you do the investigation, the same US companies get less leverage because these are the companies who don't care about the politics, they care about the money. So at the point in time when there is more instability caused by the investigation itself, they pull out. This also signals other investors because the same investors are also caring about money. So if the incentive is just money, we have a more certain benefit to that, harm to that rather, because what we show is that it's more certain that they pull out rather than staying just because there is some benefit to gain to helping the people. What this proves is that even when our worst harm is true, that some of the white men get to keep this land, at least the people there are well fed, well hospitalized, and just get the ability to live another day. It doesn't matter what the long term is right now because that in itself is inconclusive. What matters right now is the smallest margin of the debate, which we win most amount of scale in because we help the most amount of people.
Thank you, Gofwip. Opwip.
What are you doing? I want to drink water. I want to make a strategic observation from the get-go that their case is entirely contingent on increasing aid. If I prove that they don't increase aid and aid stagnates, they lose this debate immediately. Three things I'm going to do in this debate. Firstly, will aid increase? Secondly, why we need the Expropriation Act? Lastly, a trade-off. Firstly, will aid happen? I think at this point in the debate, it's somewhat deadlocked because they threw a bunch of incentives as to why it would happen. We threw a bunch of incentives as to why it won't happen. I'm going to give you three reasons why you should break deadlock in our favor. The first reason is that incentives are not unlocked if they are not perceived. Even if in the best case it is true that it's great for the US companies and businesses and people to have more aid, the problem is the US people and US politicians don't perceive that incentive. Trump does not perceive the benefits of connecting the outside world, of experiencing the outside world, with trading with the outside world. Case in point here is the academia happening in US now. Even though it's uncontroversially true that the open US academia is great for the US because it makes the US a research hub for the world. It makes the US the place you want to be if you are a scientist. The problem is that these incentives don't activate because Trump doesn't see the incentives, because Trump doesn't recognize incentives, and the American people fail to see these incentives, and as a result, the incentives don't activate because the incentives are not perceived, and they're not perceived for the reasons my earlier speaker already told you. The second deadlock breaker is that domestic incentives are more proximate as compared to the distal incentives of foreign policy and trade. Domestic incentives, as already mentioned by my earlier speakers, like electoral incentives, having to push down the cost of living, having to have like the electorally salient banner of being, look, we are cutting back foreign aid so we can give money back to American citizens and American companies. These are the things that are the short-term proximate incentives that are more pertinent for US lawmakers who are facing a midterm election, for Trump, who is facing a presidential election, for the Republican Party, who will be facing the presidential election in a few years. These are more proximate incentives than the distal incentives of like how the world and trade will look like in 10 years. So because these incentives are more proximate rather than distal, they are more likely to activate first and activate stronger. That is the second deadlock breaker. The third deadlock breaker I'm going to give you is that in the long term, even if Trump comes out of power, even the Republican Party falters, the problem is that Trump has created a rightward isolationist shift within US politics as a whole. Even Democrats must move to the right because the center has moved on foreign aid. So even if Democrats come back into power, they must have policies that cut down on foreign aid, that redistribute domestically, because if they don't have these kind of policies, they are likely to lose votes to the Republicans. So even if Donald Trump falls out of power, even if the Republicans fall out of power, the Democrats are also still going to cut down on aid, because it's an electoral incentive to do so. So in the long term, we win as well. These deadlock breakers prove to you that US aid is unreliable at best and going to taper down at worst. The next attack I get coming out from side government is that other countries will cut down aid because the investigation will say that South Africa very bad, don't put your aid there. Two reasons why the response is insufficient. The first is that given the characterization that all teams agree on, that in the current status quo, the US is a retreating position in the world state, and especially a retreating position in the world of foreign aid, it's unclear to me why other countries look up to the US as the bastion of what is good and bad when it comes to foreign aid. Right? It's unclear to me why the investigation was that big of a power. But even if you agree the investigation has power, we prove to you in time, unresponded by their whip, that the investigation will go well.
Gulf's impacts rely on the investigation going poorly. But what we and in the investigation going poorly and reviewing cracks and flaws in the South African system. But what we told you in Tan is the investigation will go well because South African legislators, South African bureaucrats know if the investigation goes poorly and exposes their flaws, investors are going to pull out. Therefore, they have an outsized incentive to reform themselves, to make sure they don't screw things up in the Expropriation Act, to make sure the investigation goes well because they know how crucial it is. I'm going to add 2 additional responses here. The first is that South Africa is a coalition government, so the ANC can't get away with rampant corruption anymore. They're going to be checked and balanced by other parties, so this reduces the scale of corruption at harm. But the second thing is, as already characterized by my earlier speakers, South Africa has a great civil society. People protest all the time about lots of things. If the Expropriation Act is done badly, people will not be afraid to protest and take to the streets and push back against government. So on the political level, there's a good reason for the investigation to go well. On the societal level, there's a good reason for the investigation to go well as well. What you should accept at this point is therefore the investigation will go well, or at least will not go as poorly as they posit. And if that's the case, then they lose all their benefits when it comes to the investigation, shattering foreign aid. Go.
Will you publish the results of the investigation and what likely findings are you going to have?
Yes, we'll publish it and we'll probably find that the Expropriation Act is doing well. That's what I was saying in the past 2 minutes. The next thing I'll talk about then is why we need the Expropriation Act. We told you very clearly from first that we need land reform for 2 key reasons. The first is to unlock crucial land, fertile land and centrally located land for crucial users. Crucial users such as giving farmers some subsistence land, so even in times of recession, they can at least farm some like tapioca and not starve to death. But the second thing is that because of the central location of this land, we need this land for infrastructure. We need this land for energy generation. We need to stop South Africa blacking out every other day. So we unlock the land for crucial users. But the second reason why we told you we need the Expropriation Act is because we need to signal to investors that we are reforming land and we are reforming the economic structure of South Africa. We are telling investors that we know this land is what you need to invest in. We know this land is crucial for your companies, and that's why we are trying to expropriate it so that you can use it effectively, and therefore please invest in us. The next thing I want to deal with then is the push from them that we don't need the Expropriation Act and the white minority has enough incentives to not do this, to give you land anyway, right? But the first reason this is not true. What's good for the country may not be good for the white minority landowner. And we proven to you in Libyan why it's not good for the white minority landowner. But even if the white people do eventually give up their land, the problem is that in their world, there will be lengthy compensation negotiations that will drag on forever because the white elites have financial and political capital to drag out these legal battles for 10 or 20 years. By then, inequality, blackouts, and investor confidence will be 10 times worse and unsolvable. We are the only one that can take the land now, solve the problem now, and prevent South Africa's death spiral. At this point, I think we win the debate outright because we prove they don't get any aid at all. But even if they get more aid, I'm willing to make the trade-off for 2 reasons. The first reason is exclusivity. There are other ways to raise capital, but there's no other way to take back the land that you need. Quite simple. But the second reason is on what is logically prior, right? You need good energy generation. You need subsistence farming so people don't starve to death. You need good land structure to show a good land reforms and economic structures to signal to investors, both locally as well as domestically, that capital can be used in productive ways, that capital can be managed in effective ways. That is the logically prior problem. The logically prior problem is effective use of capital rather than capital itself. If you cannot solve the first problem, solving the second problem does nothing. For these reasons, opposition.
Thank you, Opwip. Can we have Op reply?
Imagine if we are all leaders of South Africa trying to fix our failed state. This is their proposal. Let's not do something that is itself structurally sound, because someone else from another country may not like it. They will stop giving us money. So we are in bad shape. Our country is bankrupt, poverty is rampant. It's so bad that, as they say, people literally rely on the whims of compassionate individuals from the Western Hemisphere to get by. Their proposal is not to fix this because it might risk losing a band-aid. This deals with their case at best, because even if we end up with a law of aid, is this really a reliable way for us to provide for our people? Has anything fundamentally changed? Maybe they're fed for another day. And then what else? Because the rich still owns all the land, and we have no way to improve infrastructure so that we can attract more development. If you live yourself in a country where your leaders are people with sufficient dignity to try to make this nation stand on its own, I think you just fundamentally cannot give this motion to them. This really assumes their best case already. They have nothing to provide South Africa as a nation. They have mandates that I don't think fundamentally fix the problem. Let's look at our problem, setup, and solution. And I want to know, there is a lack of engagement as to why we do things badly. So they fundamentally agree with the way in which the problem is set up and how we fix it. They're just saying it's not worthwhile. But let's just revisit it. We posited to you that the reason why South Africa fails is because it's being held hostage by land-owning elites who bought up valuable land to stifle infrastructural development, making it so that it's extremely expensive, and therefore South Africa now deals with the problem of a lack of competitiveness, of high cost of development, and therefore it cannot grow. The solution is to take back all that land and therefore redistribute it. There's an incentive to do that because you don't want the people to take you out of power, and the reason why you have to do it urgently, as mentioned by K-Boon, is that negotiations will take a long time, and the longer you wait, the worse people suffer. Therefore, we think that the impact of our case is that firstly, we structurally fix the problem that's plaguing South Africa right now, and secondly, in unlocking that financial viability, we also unlock many other vehicles of capital, like loans and investments. And I think there is a way here to be done as to why this is more reliable. Because sympathy wanes with the conditions of people in America. But profit incentive, I suppose, is quite constant, given that the profit incentive was quite constant for the elites who end up buying all the land in the first place. This is probably a much more reliable way to preserve that capital and to use it to develop South Africa. This has no engagement whatsoever. On the flip side, I think we've given you multiple reasons as to why humanitarian aid is just not as reliable as you would think. I think what they are able to prove is some incentive to give aid, but the tipping point for them, as they say, is if the problem is so big, you have to give aid in large quantity, reliably. Any changes in the wave of compassion from the Western Hemisphere has catastrophic effect on people, because if it's the case that they are dealing with their own recession, there is no aid and your people starve. The question then is, can you afford that risk? I think the answer is no. Given of all these reasons, I think we are able to prove to you as to why it's the case that we fundamentally have to pursue this. But the last thing is to note that they don't defend that burden. It's just not that this is a bad thing. They have to prove that they will rescind it. And throughout three speakers, we received no analysis as to what happens once you rescind it. They only talk about their case on Trump. And the case is basically Trump stopped doing whatever he's doing. But what about the people right now? Because given that the act is so unpopular, the reason why it passed is probably because there's bigger electoral will to push it through. Likely coming from the people who suffer in poverty right now, with the vast majority of South Africans who will promise a change. If you rescind this, I think the problem of unrest, of riots, of protests are going to exponentially increase. What that means is they cannot even preserve their status quo, because businesses will still pull out of the country, because you still end up having to deal with more unrest, because there's going to be actual violence and deaths on the street. So, insofar as that is true, their case loses its strategic significance, because what they are saying is that things are okay right now, and therefore let's not make things worse. But that's not the actual debate. The debate is, should you take the risk of reverting against this to hedge against that risk, but is it worth the new risk that you take on insofar as to further antagonize people, so that if it's the case that that impact accrues, then they have to answer for that. For all these reasons, opposition.
Thank you, Gov Reply. To conclude this debate, Gov Reply.
The problem with the opposition is that they do not justify the risks that they take upon the full investigation. They say under this, and the reason why you would want to make them win, is that if you believe that their case is reliant on believing that white men's ownership on these major lands suggests that they do not want ever to cooperate with states to loan it, for example, in a lot of investors, if it's a way for them to breed profit as we build down the bench. If they do not, for example, never want to allow access to the public insofar as this is how they build instant profit. If you want to make them win, you would want to believe that these white men would never want to cooperate, never want to collaborate, and never want to make sure that their land has profit in the easiest way possible. At this point in the debate, perhaps US aid is minute, perhaps the US is shit, but what we uniquely identify is what the investigation brings and what the Trump administration does with this investigation. we say under this that precisely because it is public, precisely because they uncover the ways that you do corruption, the ways that you undermine licensing and ownership, that it's likely to make you look suspicious, to make you look illegitimate within the global sphere. They say, well, it won't matter because the US is already not seen well. So if they back off, that means that these things will remain. But this assumes that you will not publish the results of the investigation. But if you publish the results that they are corrupt, but if you publish the results, for example, that they do this in egregious ways, in ways that, for example, take off land that is properly bought, that means that you are likely going to delegitimize the position insofar as it is true that what they're fighting are white, strong men on their side. And therefore, they have to show why South Africa, in the way that they reclaim land, is a way that is just, is a way that is fair. But we say and we show that it's not. And it is ways, for example, that destroys your legitimacy. And it is why you want to protect yourself. It is why you don't want it to be found out. Because if it does, and it's not just the US aid that you lose a lot of aid. Aid from Europe, aid from multiple humanitarian NGOs, because you are seen as suspicious, because you are seen as evil. What that does is to make sure that people on the ground have nothing to eat. What that does is breed protests. So perhaps they shit on you because you don't get land. We say that there's an incentive to collaborate anyways, but on their side, they just have to justify a lot of people getting hungry, a lot of people not getting what they need. They say under this is that, well, you can't redistribute well because you're corrupt. But we say is that corruption or corrupt individuals will still have incentives to create good, real stuff for the economy, insofar as they don't want to get lynched, insofar as they don't want, for example, a ton of protests. And it's why you breed healthcare, it's why you build schools, and it's why you build kitchen soups. On their side, corrupt individuals corrupt more absent aid. Because if aid is the easiest way things to corrupt, absent aid on their side, because you are seen as more illegitimate, what you do is you corrupt the real things that comes from the real economy, the outputs, for example, of the investors, the outputs that comes from their side when they repossess land. And it's why it's unclear why the individuals that they say they want to protect achieves the benefit on the ground, why individuals will have jobs, and why they, for example, will have enough money to sustain themselves. We say that at least on our side in the margins, precisely because we are able to retain aid and they corrupt aid, at least they don't corrupt the other things in the real economy, and that's why it trickles down within the individuals. At this point of the debate, we don't say that US aid is just good, but what we say is that rescinding is good because you don't expose yourself towards the full investigation and the incentives of Trump to fully hammer down onto this. And this is why you're able to remain legitimate, and this is why you're able to retain the aid that you already have right now. What we say is that it is risky, and the reason why it is risky is because it is the lives of people that matter. They don't justify this risk at no extent on their speeches, and this is why we proceed to semis.